Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Wake Up with Ashland. My name is Eric Brooks. I'm the curator here at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate, and it's great to be with you this morning. Coming to you today with what will be the first of a two-part show, something we've never done, but had an opportunity to do, and I thought it would be a neat thing to do as a two-parter, so we'll see how that goes. I want to take an opportunity to thank Dupree Mutual Funds for their continued support of this series. We really enjoyed bringing it to you, and we hope you've enjoyed viewing it, and we're really appreciative of their efforts to help us do that. So we have enjoyed that a great deal. Now, with respect to today's episode, as I say, it's the first of a two-part program. Next week, we'll do the second part. And there are a couple of reasons we're doing that. One is that the subject works well as a two-part program. It's kind of a continuation of subject. But the other reason that we are going to do this is a little bit sad, I guess. Some of you probably know by now that Cameron Walpole, our manager of tours and education, will be returning to Washington, D.C. Her husband had an important job opportunity, and so they elected to do that. We are very sorry to see her go. We, of course, wish her well. She will be continuing to work remotely for Ashland, probably through the end of the year, and we'll bring you some special things from D.C. as part of this program. So we hope you will enjoy that, and we'll look forward to that in the future. But this was my week. Next week, she will be in the process of a move, so I figured, hey, this is a good opportunity. I'll do a two-parter. So I thought that would be fun. And what I want to look at is some ways in which the Clays were depicted, and ways in which they or others they associated with had their images preserved. And there are a lot of good reasons to do that, not least of which is that the Clays, Henry Clay particularly, lived at a time when a really important transition occurred, a technological innovation happened that changed the way people depicted themselves or recorded themselves. When Henry Clay was born, and up until relatively late in his life, the only way to do that was through painting or drawing. By the time that Clay was about 60 or so, it became possible to do that via photograph, and that made a huge change in the way that people preserved images. It also changed the way people communicated. So we're going to look at, this week we're going to look at some painted images. Next week we're going to transition and look at photographs and talk about different kinds of photographs and some of the history of photography and how it was important to Henry Clay. I want to say good morning to Julie. Julie Brock has tuned in. Julie is a descendant. Nice to see her. Good morning, Gaynell Warren. That's Cameron's grandmother, I believe. She's a faithful watcher, so thank you all for tuning in. So today we're going to talk about portrait miniatures. Now, we have a lot of portraits in the collection of the sort that you think of when you use that word. Large paintings, well, paintings that say 2 feet by 3 feet or whatever. Paintings that are meant to hang on a wall. Those were common. I mean, those were, well, common to people of a certain economic class who had the money to afford them. And the Clay family did. A colleague of mine, Jonna Ebling, a curator in Louisville, who does a number of projects. I worked with her on a really fascinating exhibit on horses in Kentucky. Good morning, Jonna. Thanks for joining us. So, we have a lot of portraits. This family was portrayed a great deal by a variety of artists, especially Henry Clay. But we have another kind of art in the collection that I think is really interesting, and that was relatively common during this period and used in a variety of ways, and that is the portrait miniature. Miniatures are generally a few inches in size, painted often on ivory, sometimes on other media, and they were also made in other ways. I have 6 of them that are in our collection, and some of them tell some really, really important stories. So even though they're very small, they're very interesting. So let's take a look at some of these miniatures. We'll start with this one. Turn my camera around so you can see. So that miniature is of a little girl. Her name was Lucy Clay. She was a daughter of James, Henry Clay's son. I would guess she was probably 5 or 6 when this was done. I'm trying to remember. I believe she was born in 1842. So this may have been done when James was chargé d'affaires to Portugal. 1849-50. This, obviously, is a really sweet portrait. You can see the curls, and that's a common hairdo. Notice the hair parted in the middle. Women wore their hair that way in the mid-19th century. That's quite common, so that makes sense. She's wearing a little lace dress. I'm trying to do this so you can see it a little better without the glare. It's a beautiful little miniature. This miniature is set up in a way, if I flip it over, that you can see that it can be worn as a brooch, for example. You'll also notice there's hair in it. Hair was a common thing, often saved and put into jewelry or displayed in other ways. Hair was saved because hair doesn't deteriorate. It doesn't ever go away. So it was something that people could hold on to remember people as a way of noting passage of time. You'll note that there are two colors here, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. It may be that one lock is Lucy's and one is, say, for example, her mother's, or it may be that we have two locks of Lucy's hair from two different points in her life. Oftentimes people's hair color changes, and I'll show you another miniature in which that is really, really true, and it's really interesting. But anyway, this was meant to preserve that. This, I think, was probably done during life and worn during life. Lucy was kind of an interesting person. We don't know a lot about her. Julie asks about extracting hair for DNA. We've never done that. And quite honestly, the hair in things like this probably wouldn't be useful for that. For hair to be useful for DNA analysis, it has to have been yanked out by the root, not cut. It's the root and the attached cells that have the DNA. If you cut a lock of hair off, there's no DNA in it, so it wouldn't work for that. So we've never done that. I don't think most of the hair we have was yanked out that way. That would be very painful. So unfortunately, that doesn't work too well. But Lucy first appears in letters as a child. Henry Clay went to Newport, Rhode Island to take sea baths as a treatment for illnesses that he suffered, and she apparently went along. He refers to her as poor crippled Lucy, and we don't really know why. Apparently she had a spinal condition, perhaps a scoliosis, and apparently, at least as a young child, it affected her pretty significantly. She may have grown out of that some, we don't know. But Clay mentions that he went to the beach with James and James's family, and he was a little hesitant to go in the water, but she went right in, and he figured if she went, he should go. So I guess she encouraged him to do that. Unfortunately and sadly, she died in the Civil War. She was about 18. I think she died of diphtheria, one of 3 children that James and Susan buried. So this also may have been worn as a mourning piece. This next piece I'm showing you as much as anything to show you exactly how fragile and delicate these things are. This is ivory. You can see how thin that is. Just a tiny, tiny little piece of ivory. This particular miniature is someone about which I know very little. His name was William Cogswell. He married a great-granddaughter of Henry Clay named Miriam Gratz. Miriam Gratz Clay was a granddaughter of Henry Clay's son Thomas. She also was a granddaughter of Benjamin Gratz of Gratz Park. Her mother was Benjamin Gratz's daughter, Anna. So it's part of a group of things we have relating to her. And you can see, unfortunately, it's become broken. Now, most miniatures are housed, as this one is, in frames of some sort. But if they come out of that, they're very, very fragile, and they break very, very easily. This actually was broken when we received it. So unfortunately, it's in that shape. Now, this miniature is a really neat piece. This is someone that everyone locally at least should know, and really probably all Americans. Is a very, very important person in our national history. This is the Marquita Lafayette. And this particular brooch, which again has a pin, so probably meant to be worn. Incidentally, if you're wondering about the number, that is our artifact number. All artifacts have a number, and that allows us to keep track of them. I have a digital database So I can use that number to find artifacts, find information about artifacts. When I was doing this, for example, I could pull up artifacts that way if I so chose. And you'll notice it's 3 parts. 2006.012.0004. That's called the Trinomial System, which is very common and widely used. That system means that that tells you some things about this artifact. That this piece we acquired in 2006, that it was the 12th acquisition or part of the 12th acquisition. That middle number is the number of the acquisition itself. So all of the artifacts acquired in that group would be 012. And then the last number is the specific number of the individual artifacts. So there were at least 4 artifacts in this acquisition. There's your curatorial 101 for the day. But that's the Marquita Lafayette, and the story is that, or we think, that he brought this to Ashland when he came here in 1825. He came on a national speaking tour. About the time he made that decision, Clay became Secretary of State, and so was responsible for making sure everything went well on this tour for this honored guest. He had intended to be here in town when the Marquis came, but got busy in Washington and could not get away. So the Marquis came to Ashland to visit Lucretia, and we think he gave this to Lucretia. And it passed through the family and is here today. And it's a remarkable piece and a really nice portrait, probably done in France. Now, this miniature is in a leather case, and they often had carrying cases or protective cases of this sort. You can see this one's gilt. We're lucky enough to still have the case on this one, so I'm going to open it up. And this is really unique. This is a somewhat 3D image. I'll try to see if I can get this where you don't have so much glare. This image is in wax. Somebody carved this, added hair of some sort. It's a remarkable thing, to see. And it's in a sort of a cloison case. You can see the loop. Sometimes miniatures of this sort were worn on a ribbon around the neck. Otherwise, it might have been suspended on a cord, hung from a hook, or it may have just been displayed in this case. You can see it's silk lined. This is the original case, as far as I know. Juan Agustin de Iturbide was a minor noble living in Mexico, a supporter of the Spanish royalists. Eventually, he turned on the royalists and supported Spanish independence, primarily not because he was really opposed to the Spanish crown, but because he was afraid that if he didn't support a certain movement in Mexico, that it would become a republic rather than a monarchy. He ended up becoming Emperor of Mexico. He and Clay corresponded. At the time, this was 1822, Clay at that point was engaged in a great deal of support for Latin American nations that were emerging from colonial rule. And so he was trying to help Mexico, I think, emerge from that rule. Anyway, Iturbide sent this and indicates in his letter that he was looking forward to receiving a return image from Henry Clay. We don't know if Henry Clay ever sent one, or if so, what that image was. But it's a really interesting piece, and this 3D effect, like I say, is just really remarkable. You got the lamb chops and everything. And beautiful, beautiful miniature. Incredibly artistic. And the family did us the favor. You can see on the back here, they wrote notes about who this is. Emperor Iturbide of Mexico, presented to Henry Clay. Iturbide, among other things, is the man who is responsible for Mexico being called Mexico. He also designed the modern Mexican flag. So there are some important things he did. Now, this miniature is modern. This was done by an artist named Lorschner, who apparently did illustrations for books. I don't know if this was ever actually used in a book. It is said to be on ivory. I would suspect it's actually on some sort of reproduction ivory rather than real ivory. It's very hard to get real ivory today. So anyway, that's a little different. This was done in between 1950 and 60. So there aren't a lot of people that do this sort of thing anymore, but it was done at least at that time. It's a nice picture of Henry Clay. And that one's been framed and matted. And now we get to the last one, and this is really the most important. This is the big finale, if you will. And here again we have an original case, a leather case. You see there's a little latch on the side. So it's oval. I open the case up, lined with green silk, and that's the miniature. And you may be wondering who that is. If you're not familiar with it, that's Henry Clay. That is the earliest known image of Henry Clay, and we believe it was done in 1805 by an artist named Benjamin Trott. Trott was an artist who had come to Lexington at that time looking for business, wanting to paint miniatures. We think that he is the one that painted Clay, and we think that because of some of the artistic elements, the nature of the face, etc. You can also see behind Clay there are clouds. That's something pretty typical of Trott miniatures. You'll notice Clay's hair is very white. Lucretia, apparently, according to Clay's executor, James O. Harrison, she said of Clay when he was young that he had the whitest head of hair she had ever seen. Well, that obviously changed. It darkened considerably. Let's see if I can get this picture. That's Clay in later life. You can see his hair is pretty dark and a little straighter. So, like many people, his hair obviously changed over the course of years. So it's fascinating to have this artifact in our collection. We have a number of other paintings done of Clay across his life, some done pretty late in life, but it's really neat to have the earliest known image. The ivory and wax materials truly are amazing. I mean, it's incredible what was able to be produced on such fragile, delicate, and hard to work with materials. So we have a really interesting collection of these in our collection. Some really great art. Most of these are not exhibited all the time, but we bring them out from time to time for various things. And next week, in our two-part series, we're going to move to a different type of images. We're going to talk about photography. The first successful repeatable photographic process was invented in about 1833 by a man named Daguerre, and it changed the world. It changed the way the world communicated. It changed the way people recorded their own lives, and we're going to look at that. And we're going to talk about Henry Clay, one of the first people to be widely photographed. And we're going to look at a variety of different kinds of photographs because we have a bunch of them in the collection. And you can see the development of photography over time. So I'm looking very forward to that. I look forward to sharing that with you next week. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Well, thank you again for tuning in. It's great to have you with us, as it is every week. I'll be back same time, same channel next week. Have a good weekend. Thank you.